Good evening. I'm Serena, and this is Inside News Weekly for Saturday, October 11th, 2025. Each week, we examine the stories that matter but receive insufficient attention. The events shaping lives across continents while major networks chase ratings and controversy. Tonight, we move through Africa, Europe, the Americas, and Asia, then turn to critical issues the mainstream press consistently ignores in our Beyond the Blindspot segment. Let's begin. Africa. Political tensions escalated across the continent this week, starting with West Africa. Burkina Faso's military government refused to accept deportees from the United States, prompting Washington to suspend visa issuance for Burkinabe citizens. The decision affects students, business travelers, and families dependent on remittances. The government argues that forced returns without bilateral agreements violate national sovereignty, a stance reflecting broader frustrations with Western migration policies. The suspension compounds internal pressures as jihadist threats persist in eastern provinces, where army patrols continue operations against militant groups. Morocco entered its second week of sustained civil unrest. Youth-led protests demanding transparency and economic reform spread through Casablanca and Rabat. 3 deaths have been confirmed, with hundreds arrested. Human rights organizations called for investigations into police conduct after reports of excessive force. The protests, organized through social media, center on unemployment rates, rising costs, and perceived elite corruption. Authorities promised reforms and inquiries, but tensions remain high. This movement signals a generational shift in North African activism, with implications for political stability. South Africa faced economic volatility. The rand weakened on October 6th amid uncertainty over the U.S. government shutdown and its potential global effects. Investors worried about impacts on commodity exports, particularly gold. The European Union offered partial relief with an €11.5 billion pledge to support the country's transition to renewable energy. The funds target green hydrogen and electric battery projects, aiming to reduce coal dependence and create employment. Domestic challenges persisted as trucker strikes caused riots along the N3 corridor, disrupting logistics and causing arrests at major ports. In Cameroon, President Paul Biya announced his candidacy for an 8th term at age 92. The October 12th election occurs amid heightened security in Yaoundé and a ban on some opposition activities. Opposition candidates courted voters in Anglophone regions, forging alliances and promising reforms to address marginalization. Biya's extended rule faces criticism for authoritarian practices. Youth protests elsewhere on the continent could influence turnout in troubled Western areas. Somalia experienced a major security incident. Al-Shabaab launched an assault on Godka Jilakau prison in Mogadishu, resulting in hours of combat before attackers were neutralized. The government tightened checkpoints in the capital's green zone. Separately, a U.S. drone strike in Sanag region killed a local elder, raising questions about civilian casualties in counterterrorism operations. The incidents underscore persistent challenges from insurgent groups in the Horn of Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo announced plans for its central bank to build gold reserves as global prices surge. The strategy aims to strengthen economic stability in the mineral-rich nation. President Tshisekedi accused Rwanda of supporting M23 rebels, whose operations in North Kivu have displaced thousands and strained aid corridors. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court convicted a Darfur militia leader for atrocities, marking progress toward accountability for victims of Sudan's ongoing conflicts. Madagascar imposed a nationwide curfew after youth-led protests over power outages and governance failures resulted in deaths and injuries. Demonstrations in Antananarivo and Tawamasina drew international attention, with the UN calling for restraint. The Prime Minister condemned excessive force by security personnel. The unrest reflects deeper frustrations with infrastructure failures and political accountability. Nigeria conducted police operations in Kaduna, freeing abducted students and eliminating suspected kidnappers as part of broader security sweeps in the northwest. The Ghana cedi was noted as Africa's best-performing currency for the first 8 months of 2025, according to World Bank data, contrasting with Nigeria's food inflation affecting millions in poverty. U.S. Senator Jim Risch called for action against the targeting of Christians by terrorists in Nigeria and other African nations, highlighting religious persecution amid political and ethnic tensions. Europe. France dominated European headlines. President Emmanuel Macron reappointed Sébastien Lecornu as Prime Minister on October 10th, following Lecornu's resignation on October 7th. The move occurred amid severe political instability after recent legislative elections and internal government tensions. Lecornu faces immediate pressure to present a budget to Parliament, avoiding fiscal paralysis. The Rassemblement National under Marine Le Pen capitalizes on this chaos to strengthen its position. The reappointment could temporarily stabilize the executive, but risks aggravating parliamentary divisions and deepening societal polarization. Intense debates are expected in coming days. Post-Brexit relations saw new complications. Starting October 13th, British travelers to the European Union must submit to biometric border controls via entry-exit system kiosks. The measures enhance security and tracking for non-EU travelers, including UK citizens. The changes stem from 2020 post-Brexit agreements imposing new administrative barriers. At least one-third of EU citizens in the UK report unfair treatment by public institutions. Adding to existing frustrations, the economic impact could include slower tourism and business travel, affecting aviation and hospitality industries. Social tensions between the UK and EU face renewed pressure. The European Union introduced new rules making instant euro payments faster and more secure, effective October 9th. Individuals and businesses can now transfer money in seconds, 24 hours daily, within countries or across the Eurozone. The modernization aims to compete with global digital services and reduce dependence on slow traditional payment systems. Benefits include improved economic fluidity and reduced consumer costs. But cybersecurity challenges remain to prevent fraud. The EU eco-label reached a record with over 109,000 certified products under 3,300 licenses, led by Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. This reflects a push towards sustainability, promoting eco-responsible products, and boosting green markets. The UK steel crisis intensified. Comments published October 10th attribute the crisis largely to Brexit, which exacerbated job losses, increased commercial costs, and reduced British steel mills' competitiveness in European markets. Post-2020 customs barriers isolated the sector despite initial revival promises. The situation threatens thousands of jobs in regions dependent on heavy industry, pressuring Keir Starmer's Labour government for reforms and potentially influencing Conservative Party debates. The EU defended a new plan to curb steel imports with higher tariffs, protecting European jobs against global competition. Defense and geopolitical tensions surfaced at an EU summit in Copenhagen on October 8th, criticized for focusing on internal disputes rather than unified action against Russia amid persistent tensions with Ukraine. The ongoing war since 2022 includes Russian violations of European airspace and critical infrastructure. European parliamentarians voted this week for stricter measures. The lack of cohesion potentially weakens Europe's security position, increasing NATO dependence and risking escalation of migration and energy crises. Munich airport operations were suspended due to drone alerts, later revealed as false, illustrating anti-Russian hysteria in Europe. accusations emerged that Ukraine simulates threats to obtain American missiles. Nobel Prizes marked the week. The 2025 Literature Prize went to Hungarian writer Laszlo Krasznahorkai on October 9th for his visionary work affirming art's power against apocalyptic terror. The Peace Prize was awarded to Venezuelan politician Maria Corina Machado, but an investigation was launched into suspicious betting patterns on platforms like Polymarket, raising manipulation concerns. The context is the annual October announcement, with implications for European institutions' credibility involved in surveillance. This could affect online betting markets and highlight ethical vulnerabilities in global events. Agricultural and budgetary developments included EU finance ministers discussing Commission proposals to update the European budget's own resources on October 6th, strengthening community financing. The official launch of the European Partnership for Agriculture Data under Horizon Europe emphasizes digital transformation of the sector. European parliamentarians voted to simplify EU agricultural rules and strengthen farmers' positions in food supply chains. These developments, amid inflationary pressures accumulated from 2020 to 2025, could stabilize rural European economy, but require harmonized implementation to avoid regional disparities. The Americas. The United States government shutdown entered its second week after Congress failed to reach a budget agreement. The impasse affects key sectors, including air transportation, where already understaffed air traffic controllers face worsening conditions. Millions of federal employees are on unpaid leave. Non-essential services are suspended, including certain payments and inspections. This political crisis highlights partisan divisions, with Republicans and Democrats accusing each other of obstruction. The shutdown could last several weeks without an agreement. A potential peace accord in the Gaza war made headlines with direct U.S. involvement. Sources indicate Israel and Hamas accepted in principle an American proposal to end the conflict, including a ceasefire and hostage exchanges. President Donald Trump urged Israel to stop bombardments. Netanyahu and Hamas sent positive signals regarding the plan. This could mark a major diplomatic turning point for the American administration, potentially contending for a Nobel Peace Prize, though the White House criticized the Nobel Committee for not awarding Trump. 2 Israeli embassy employees in Washington, D.C. were shot and killed outside the Capitol Jewish Museum after attending an American Jewish Committee event. The incident raises concerns about diplomatic security in the United States and tensions related to Middle East conflict. Authorities investigate a possible anti-Semitic or geopolitical motive, with increased security measures around diplomatic sites. A tragic aviation accident occurred in Philadelphia when a medical transport jet crashed in a northeastern neighborhood. The incident killed 4 passengers, 2 crew members, and 1 person on the ground, injuring 19 others. Causes are under investigation, highlighting risks of emergency medical flights and impacts on local communities. Southern California wildfires, notably the Palisades Fire and Eaton Fire, were finally contained after weeks of fighting. These fires, among the last of a devastating series in January 2025, destroyed extensive areas and forced evacuations. A suspect was arrested in connection with the Palisades Fire, suspected of intentionally starting the blaze. This closes a destructive chapter for the region, with reconstruction efforts underway. In Costa Rica, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal requested the lifting of President Rodrigo Chavez's immunity, suspected of financial irregularities during his electoral campaign. This procedure could lead to formal investigation and potentially impeachment, marking a major political crisis. Chavez, known for controversial positions, denies allegations. The situation divides public opinion and could affect governmental stability. Haiti saw the rebel alliance Vive Ensemble expand its influence amid persistent troubles. The expansion includes new controlled territories and alliances with other factions, worsening security instability. Protests erupted against corruption and economic policies, with calls for international intervention to restore order in a country already weakened by violence and humanitarian crises. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her struggle against dictatorship. She dedicated the award to Venezuelans in exile and those fighting for democracy. The prize highlights persistent tensions in Venezuela, where the Maduro government remains in power despite electoral challenges. Venezuela released 6 American hostages, a gesture potentially signaling détente with the United States. Brazil saw protests following former President Jair Bolsonaro's conviction on charges related to corruption and post-electoral events. Demonstrators, both supporters and opponents, marched in several cities demanding justice or proclaiming his innocence. This revives deep political divisions, with implications for stability under current President Lula's government, which faces its own economic challenges. Argentina experienced massive demonstrations targeting President Javier Milei's policies, accused of corruption and austere economic measures worsening poverty. Protesters, including unions and civil groups, demand social reforms and investigation into embezzlement allegations. This underscores persistent economic challenges in Argentina, with high inflation and budget cuts affecting middle and lower classes. In Peru, the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua extended its influence in Peruvian prisons, leading to internal violence and national security concerns. This criminal group, involved in trafficking and extortion, exploits weaknesses in the prison system, forcing authorities to strengthen control measures. This reflects transnational challenges of organized crime in South America. Colombia's president reported the deaths of several Colombians in a boat bombing in the United States, an incident raising questions about links between cross-border crime and drug networks. This could lead to increased cooperation with American authorities to investigate motives and prevent future attacks. Asia. China's Golden Week from October 1st to 8th recorded 888 million domestic trips, breaking previous records. The 8-day holiday, extended by the overlap with National Day, reflected strong demand for domestic tourism despite persistent economic challenges. Average spending per traveler dropped to a 3-year low, signaling consumer caution amid inflation and economic uncertainty. This disappointed expectations for vigorous consumption recovery. The holiday period produced massive traffic jams on highways, particularly at Wuzhong Toll Plaza, considered Asia's largest, where queues stretched for kilometers as millions returned home. The scale illustrates logistical challenges posed by mass movements in the world's most populous nation. Typhoon Matmo made landfall in Guangdong province on October 5th, causing major transport disruptions and forcing evacuation of over 151,000 people as a precautionary measure. The storm raised fears of significant flooding due to torrential rains and violent winds, particularly affecting coastal areas and infrastructure. Authorities activated emergency plans to minimize damage. The event fits into an active cyclone season in Southeast Asia, underlining growing regional vulnerability to climate crisis. India experienced catastrophic landslides in Darjeeling and Meerut Hills in West Bengal between October 4th and 5th. Heavy rains triggered massive slides, killing at least 20 people, including several children with numerous injuries. The disasters destroyed homes and roads, leaving several missing. Local government chief Mamata Banerjee announced compensation for victims without specifying details. Separately, in Madhya Pradesh, a doctor was arrested in connection with the deaths of at least 11 children from potentially contaminated cough syrup, highlighting pharmaceutical safety problems in rural areas. The Philippines was struck by a magnitude 6.9 earthquake on October 5th, followed by another tremor on October 10th that killed at least one person and caused property damage. This added to a previous quake on Cebu Island 1 week earlier. These seismic events heightened concerns about infrastructure preparedness in this disaster-prone region, with calls to strengthen resilience measures. In Tibet, more than 550 people were trapped by a blizzard on the eastern slope of Mount Everest on October 5th, requiring urgent rescue operations in extreme conditions. Related landslides from intense rains killed over 60 people in India and Nepal, illustrating devastating impacts of weather phenomena on Himalayan regions. China announced a key Communist Party meeting for late October 2025 to discuss the forthcoming 5-year plan, amid commercial tensions with the United States. Former President Donald Trump threatened to impose massive tariffs in response to Chinese restrictions on rare earth minerals and suspension of iron ore imports from BHP. These developments underscore persistent geopolitical frictions affecting global supply chains. Pakistan's military forces eliminated 30 militants involved in an attack that killed 11 soldiers as part of ongoing counter-terrorism operations in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The action marks an intensification of efforts to counter groups like Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan. Indonesia's government refused visas to Israeli gymnasts due to protests linked to the Gaza conflict. The finance minister projects 6% growth following a $12 billion liquidity injection, reflecting efforts to stimulate the economy. Australia reversed its policy by committing to maintain coal use for energy in Queensland. In Japan, Sanae Takaichi won election to the presidency of the Liberal Democratic Party on October 4th, opening a new political phase, often described as heavy metal, due to her direct style, with implications for regional relations in Asia. Afghanistan reported a total internet blackout, potentially linked to internal tensions or government measures, affecting communications and access to information across the country. The 78th session of the WHO Regional Committee for Southeast Asia began in Colombo on October 10th, focusing on regional health priorities. Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to figures, including Uber co-founder Travis Kalanick, to attract international talent. Now our special segment, Beyond the Blind Spot. We turn now to stories from this week that demand attention but receive almost none. These are not peripheral issues. They are crises unfolding in real time while cameras point elsewhere. Sudan, the invisible war. At least 20 civilians were killed this week in attacks targeting a mosque. And the last hospital in El Fasher, the besieged capital of North Darfur State. UN experts expressed grave concern at reports of indiscriminate killings, mass displacement, sexual violence, enforced disappearance, and obstruction of humanitarian assistance in Sudan, warning that the scale and severity of the violations may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The numbers are staggering. Over 30 million people in Sudan are in need of humanitarian and protection assistance, with nearly 12 million people forcibly displaced since the beginning of the conflict. Sudan's Ministry of Health has reported over 60,000 cholera cases and more than 1,600 deaths between August 2024 and May 2025. This week's attacks on El Fasher targeted not just any hospital, but the last functioning medical facility in the capital. When the final hospital in a besieged city comes under fire, it signals the complete breakdown of humanitarian norms. When a mosque is attacked during a war, it demonstrates that no sanctuary remains. The conflict between Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary has created what humanitarian officials call a full-scale public health disaster. Soaring food and fuel prices exacerbate the humanitarian crisis as a shrinking economy plunges many into poverty. Delivering aid remains extraordinarily difficult due to the protracted conflict, ongoing insecurity, theft of aid supplies, attacks on aid workers and responders, fuel shortages, and systematic obstruction. Compare the coverage. Gaza receives daily headlines. Ukraine maintains constant media presence. Sudan, with more displaced people than any other crisis, receives mentions in passing, if at all. The scale of human suffering is equivalent. The strategic implications are significant. The moral imperative is identical. The coverage is non-existent. Pharmaceutical contamination, a recurring crisis. In Madhya Pradesh, India, 11 children died this week from contaminated cough syrup. A doctor was arrested in connection with the deaths. The story received minimal international attention, despite representing a systemic failure that has killed thousands globally. Over the past 90 years, at least 25 documented incidents of excipient contamination have resulted in more than 1,300 deaths worldwide, many of them children. The 2025 coal drift scandal, where diethylene glycol contaminated syrup killed 11 to 14 children, underscored the urgency of centralized regulation. Tamil Nadu's drug controller failed to detect diethylene glycol in Sracin pharmaceutical syrup, and Madhya Pradesh's delayed response allowed continued distribution. This is not an isolated incident. Over 300 people in Africa died in October 2022 from similar contamination events. The pattern is consistent. Contaminated pharmaceutical ingredients enter supply chains through inadequate oversight, kill children in developing nations, prompt investigations that reveal systemic failures, generate promises of reform, then fade from public consciousness until the next outbreak. The contamination agent is typically diethylene glycol, an industrial solvent used in antifreeze. It tastes sweet. It mixes easily with liquid medications. It destroys kidneys and causes death. It appears in pharmaceutical supply chains because it costs less than proper pharmaceutical-grade glycerin. Companies substitute it to increase profit margins. Regulatory agencies fail to detect it because testing is inadequate or non-existent. Children die because they are the primary consumers of liquid medications. The recent deaths of children in Chhinwara, Madhya Pradesh, allegedly caused by contaminated cough syrups, have jolted India's pharmaceutical regulators into action. The Central Drug Standard Control Organization has directed all state and union territory drug controllers to enforce quality standards. The same language appears after each incident. Regulators are jolted into action. Enforcement is directed. Standards will be strengthened, then silence until the next deaths. Why this week's stories matter. Sudan's conflict this week attacked the last hospital in a besieged capital. That represents a threshold. When belligerents systematically eliminate medical infrastructure in areas they cannot control, it signals intent to make civilian life impossible. The goal is not military victory, but population elimination through creating uninhabitable conditions. India's contaminated syrup deaths this week killed children through supply chain failures that have repeated for 90 years. That represents not isolated negligence, but structural indifference. When the same type of contamination kills children across continents and decades, when investigations reveal the same regulatory gaps, when reforms are promised, then abandoned, it demonstrates that preventing these deaths is not treated as a priority. Both crises share characteristics. They disproportionately affect the powerless. They result from systemic failures rather than isolated incidents. They have clear solutions that remain unimplemented, and they receive minimal, sustained coverage despite massive human costs. The question is not whether these crises are important enough to cover. The question is why they are not covered. Sudan has more displaced people than Ukraine. Pharmaceutical contamination has killed over 1,300 children in documented incidents alone. These are not small stories. They are major humanitarian disasters unfolding in real time. The answer is uncomfortable. These stories lack elements that drive engagement. They do not involve Western nations directly. They do not feature identifiable villains or heroes suitable for narrative framing. They require sustained attention rather than episodic coverage. And they demand acknowledgement of systemic failures rather than individual accountability. Modern journalism has optimized for engagement over importance. The result is predictable. Stories that matter, but do not perform well in algorithms, receive minimal coverage. People die in silence because their deaths do not generate clicks. The stories we covered tonight span continents and crises. Political instability in France and Cameroon, economic pressures in South Africa and Argentina, security threats in Somalia and Haiti, environmental destruction in California. And beneath all of this, the slow collapse of systems we depend on for survival: water and antibiotics, the foundations of civilization. Good journalism requires more than reporting what happened today. It requires examining what is happening beneath the surface, the trends that shape tomorrow, the crises building in plain sight while cameras point elsewhere. We produce this program because the mainstream press consistently fails this basic responsibility, because entertainment has replaced investigation, because outrage has replaced analysis, because what drives clicks and ratings receives coverage, while what matters for survival does not. You deserve better. We all do. With good journeys to all, good night.